On the right-hand scale there, if you look, you can see the figure 16. So if you had 16 grams of C14, which you wouldn't have because we're only talking about tiny amounts, but if you came back after 5,730 years, only half of it would have decayed. In other words, it's not C14 anymore, it's decayed back to nitrogen. If you came back after another 5,730 years, you'll find there's only 4 grams of C14, and so on. And so the theory is that if you know how much C14 is in a piece of material, you can date it. Now, the shroud was made from flax. The Shroud of Turin is authentic and was manufactured at the time of Christ. And the linen in the shroud, manufactured around 33 AD, already had radioactive C14 in it because it's made from flax, which is plants, which has got radioactive C14 in it. So the shroud from the time of Christ had radioactive C14 in it. Now, this is very important. Carbon dating doesn't actually date anything. What happens is the people who interpret the results basically use the known rate of decay of C14, and using this known rate of decay, you can see in the British Museum that various specialists have said that the Shroud of Turin, based on carbon dating, is based 1260 to 1390. The AD 1260 to 1390 date was calculated by secular scientists who haven't taken into account the physics of the resurrection, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, this is very important to understand. It's not that complicated. According to carbon dating theory, if the shroud had very little radioactive C14 in it, the radioactive C14 must therefore have decayed, and it must be dated 33 AD. So on the right, they have a very pale shroud, which indicates that there's very little radioactive C14 in it. The glass is empty, and that would be a 33 AD shroud. But what they actually found was, on the right there, a very bright shroud, shall we say, indicating lots and lots of radioactivity. There's a glass half full to illustrate we're talking about lots and lots of radioactivity in this shroud, and therefore they say that according to the laws of carbon dating, it must be medieval, and maybe, they haven't actually said, but a lot of people say that Leonardo da Vinci created the shroud. So just to go through that once again, a very pale shroud, very little radioactivity, it's all decayed, an empty glass, it's the 33 AD shroud. A 1325 AD shroud would be, on the right there, lots of radioactivity, lots of C14 present, therefore it must be medieval, therefore possibly Leonardo da Vinci or somebody else created it. I hope you can understand that. A pale shroud, 33 AD, very little radioactivity, lots of radioactivity, it's a medieval shroud, 1325. Now, Leonardo da Vinci couldn't have created the Shroud of Turin. He just couldn't, it's not possible. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was a supremely gifted Renaissance artist, designer, scientist, engineer, and thinker, and many people believe he created the Shroud of Turin. Barrie Schwortz, the official Shroud of Turin photographer, has publicly stated that the Shroud of Turin could not be created by the cleverest scientists in the world today. In fact, I've said earlier, it would be easier for Leonardo da Vinci to have designed and launched the Hubble Space Telescope, which was actually launched in 1990. Now, NASA planned the work on the Hubble Space Telescope in 1970, and my point is this: the technology is now available for Leonardo da Vinci to create a Hubble Space Telescope. But the laser technology is not available today in 2009 for Leonardo da Vinci or anybody else to create a Shroud of Turin, because nobody's got that technology. So nobody can create a fake Shroud of Turin in 2009. So I want to now issue a challenge for all the Shroud of Turin skeptics, of which there are many out there, because most people think the Shroud of Turin is a fraud. Before you start, let me remind you of the challenges you face to create a fraudulent Shroud of Turin. First, you need to obtain a first-century piece of precious Jewish linen in a specific weave, 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide exactly. This must exactly match the identical linen from Masada, Israel, woven in a specific way on a special ancient loom. Basically, this is unavailable according to Mechtild Fleury Lemberg, a worldwide authority on ancient textiles. This piece of linen is very specific and must contain pollen from Jerusalem and calcium aragonite from ancient Jerusalem. And then you need to obtain not one but two different Roman leptons, coins, both minted by Pontius Pilate in AD 29. Now, there are only 13 known specimens in the entire world of all 5 of the Pontius Pilate coins, but you need 2 more minted in AD 29. I'm going to say you're going to find that quite difficult to find 2 more. Then you've got to apply human blood type AB with a very high content of bilirubin, because that's what, when victims are tortured, as happened during the crucifixion, there's a high bilirubin content in the blood. Now, the special blood must now be applied to your fraudulent cloth in exactly the right places to correctly demonstrate the scourging, the crown of thorns, the crucifixion nails, and the Roman lance. And you've got to apply the human blood before you burn the image on the shroud. There's no image under the blood, so the blood must be applied first. And the blood that you apply must exactly match the identical blood on the Serum of Oviedo in Spain, which is kept in a closely guarded sealed wooden box. Now, we suggest you wait for 3 days and 3 nights because that's what we've believed happened in the case of the original, but what you do is entirely up to you. But that's actually, all of that's very simple compared with the next part. Now you've got to scorch an image of a crucified man onto the linen using an unknown laser radiation technique in photonegative for the image and photopositive for the blood. The technology, as I keep saying, is currently unavailable in 2009. Your scorch marks must contain distance imaging 3-dimensional properties which will convince scientists using NASA's VP8 image analyzing computer. Now, the Shroud of Turin, as I must remind you, is the only known image on Earth that contains these 3-dimensional properties. We'd actually love you to create another one. We'd love to see how you're going to do it. Now, when you created this second Shroud of Turin, please put C14 on it to your 2009 fraud, so it will be dated to 1325 by radiocarbon dating. But before you do that, let me warn you that nobody has ever managed to apply radioactive C14 to any material to actually predate it by 700 years before the material's actual date. Now you've got to convince the whole world that the Serum of Oviedo in Spain, which contains identical blood type AB and identical blood marks to your fraud, is also a fraud just like yours. You've also got to convince the whole world that the Hungarian Prague Codex manuscript dated 1192, which shows the same herringbone weave and identical patterns of small poker burn holes found in your fraud, is also a fraud. Now, the Shroud of Turin is the single most studied artifact in human history, according to Chuck Missler. You've got a very difficult test now. You've got to convince literally thousands and thousands of highly qualified scientists, including many professors in their field, that your fraud possesses all of the properties of the Shroud of Turin. These will include photographic experts, nuclear physicists, botanists, archaeologists, historians, forensic pathologists, radiologists, carbon dating experts, textile specialists, and experts in ancient Jewish antiquities. A whole list of them. We've covered some of them, but there are a whole lot more we haven't discussed. Now we come to an even more difficult challenge for you, because, you see, Leonardo da Vinci is credited with doing 2 things. First of all, he created an image using technology which is not available now. In 2009, nobody can create a 3-dimensional image like the Shroud. And secondly, create an image which was analyzed by the VP8 image analyzing computer, which is technology which was only available 500 years after he died. So therefore, you've got to be able to see into the future to pass part 2 of the test. Part 2 of the test is to create an image using unavailable technology. That's your first part, and then see into the future and accurately predict the technology which will be available 500 years from now in the year 2509 to scientifically validate your image. Your image must be unique in the whole of the Earth in the year 2509, just like the Shroud is now. Now, here's a conclusion to any rational and unprejudiced scientists. The Shroud of Turin is unique, and the technology is not understood, and nor is it ever likely to be. The Shroud of Turin is from the time of Jesus, with an image of a crucified man perfectly formed in photonegative with 3-dimensional properties. Dame Isabel Pixek, I mentioned before, she's also a particle physicist and explains the physics of the image on the shroud. She says that the formation of the image on at the formation of the image on the shroud, there was an event horizon when the body of Jesus was suspended in space with zero gravity. She says that at the formation of the image on the shroud, there was no gravity, no entropy, no gravitational collapse, no time, and no space. And she says that this conforms to no known laws of physics and is a true event horizon. Now, Dr. August Setter has actually discovered how the image of the Shroud of Turin was actually formed. It was formed by radiation. Now, Dr. August Setter is a radiologist in California and founder of the Shroud Center of Southern California, and he did a very interesting experiment on himself. Remember, he's a radiologist, and he said he believed that the image on the shroud was similar to an X-ray and that the image was caused by a blast of nuclear radiation. So he discovered, in our opinion, exactly how the image on the shroud was formed. And he's actually very humble about his amazing discovery. He was convinced of the authenticity of the shroud, and he believed that the image on the shroud was caused by a burst of radioactivity. So he injected himself with radioactive material and produced an image with dimensionally encoded information. And then he put himself under the VPA image analyzing computer and produced on the right there a three-dimensional image of himself, similar but not as good as the shroud, without using any paint or pigment of any sort. You can read about his discovery on shroud.com. Now, just for the scientists who are watching, this is what he actually did. He said, "We have used a human model labeled with radioactive methylene diphosphonate to successfully reproduce some of the many shroud image characteristics such as borderless density shading, soft tissue and skeletal information, vertical alignment and non-contact imaging. This was achieved by capturing emitted radiation using a gamma camera and vertical collimator. Conclusion: some significant shroud image characteristics can be best explained using an emitting radiation model. No other human model we know of has approximated the shroud image this closely." So we now know that the image on the shroud was caused by a burst of nuclear radiation. And also the shroud has X-ray qualities. You can see what appears to be X-ray features of Jesus' hands on the left, and on the right, if you look very carefully, you can make out teeth, because the shroud has on the left there X-ray properties, and you can make out some teeth. So there's also another image on the back of the shroud corresponding to Jesus' face, and so there are unknown X-ray properties of the shroud. Conclusion: the X-ray appearances on the shroud support Dr. Setter's theory that the image was caused by radiation. Now we're going to try and, we're not going to be able to do this, but I have a theory about how this came about. And to do this, we have to study the resurrected and glorified body of Jesus Christ. You see, the Bible says that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. At the Transfiguration, which is in Matthew 17, it says, "After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Jesus." Well, at the Transfiguration, Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. So we're also told in Revelation chapter 1 that when John saw Jesus Christ in heaven, it says, "And standing among them was one who looked like Jesus, who called himself the Son of Man." And this is what John says, "And his face shone like the power of the sun in unclouded brilliance." Now notice that Jesus' face is brighter than the sun at noon. So when Jesus Christ was resurrected, the light from his face and his body obviously shone through the shroud. And we believe that the radiation emitted at the resurrection caused the photonegative image complete with three-dimensional properties. And now we're going to look at light. Now light is actually formed of photons moving in a waveform. We cover this in our creation seminar. But light from the sun in outer space actually includes visible